Romans chapter 8, verse 24 says, "For in hope we have been saved." The next verse says, "We hope for what we do not see, and with perseverance we eagerly wait for it." I want to talk with you this morning about hope, in particular the hope of heaven, and the role that ought to play in our lives, and how it enables us to serve God well. The first thing I want us to think about is the question, why should we hope in heaven? What makes it so worthy of hope? Well, the first thing you might think about is heaven's a lot better than the alternative. And, sometimes we think about that thought and say, well, we ought to be better than that. We ought to want heaven for heaven. But it's not an illegitimate thing to want to avoid the alternative. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 26 and 27. "If we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a certain terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of a fire which will consume the adversaries." I think God tells us that for a reason. You don't want that version of an afterlife. But at the same time, it's true. We ought to hope for heaven for more than that. Beyond that initial fear of hell, we ought to learn all that there really is to hope for in heaven itself. And I want to tell you that heaven is our home. Heaven is where we belong. When you go on a trip somewhere and you're gone for several days or maybe a week or two, and you enjoy everything about that trip, but almost everybody experiences the feeling of getting home and just, man, it's nice to be home. Now, I'm sure some people live in some circumstances where that's not the case. But for most of us, maybe all of us here, it's just nice to be home. Why is it nice to be home? Because things fit at home. They're just the way you like them. And that's true of heaven, our home. It's the recreation in a more full way of what God offered to mankind in the Garden of Eden. Think back to the Garden of Eden and what that was, that place that God created for man. We belonged there. God gave us everything in that place that was good for man, very richly, and gave man himself in the Garden of Eden. We read about Adam and Eve walking with God in the Garden of Eden, that fellowship that was between them and God, that complete lack of conflict, that everything was right. It was all harmony between God and man. And heaven, as I mentioned, is the more perfect restoration of that. It's where we belong. It's where we fit. But I know a lot of people, maybe you, I know I did, had qualms, kind of wondered, I know I want to go there, because this is a whole lot better than hell, I am sure. But will I really like it there? Or will it be strange? Will it be kind of weird for me? Does it fit me? Or do I fit it? And although I've thought that thought before, I want to tell you that's a silly thought to have. When we're in this world and we think that heaven won't fit us and we won't fit it, when we live in this world with all its conflict and corruption and perversion of good things into evil things, all the distractions that pull us away from God, and we think we might not be happy in heaven. Heaven is where we belong. It's what we were created for. In Matthew 25 and verse 34, when Jesus is talking about that day when the king will call forward everybody, the sheep on his right and the goats on his left, and he says to the sheep on his right, come and inherit the kingdom prepared for you prepared for you from the foundation of the world. God knows us better than anybody. God knows us better than we know ourselves. And that's the place he's prepared for us. Philippians chapter 3, verse 20 says our citizenship is in heaven. And I want to turn to Hebrews chapter 11 and begin reading in verse 13. Hebrews chapter 11, beginning in verse 13. You know Hebrews chapter 11. It's that chapter that's kind of the hall of fame of faith of Old Testament characters. By faith, Abraham did this. By faith, Noah did that. By faith, Sarah did this. All those Old Testament characters that lived by faith and did difficult things because they had that faith in God and what God would offer them. And so we read as we get down to verse 13 of Hebrews chapter 11, after the Hebrews author has just mentioned Abraham and Sarah, who came from Ur of the Chaldees over to this land that God told them to go to. Hebrews 11:13, all these died in faith without receiving the promises. Well, didn't Abraham receive that land? Yeah, he did. Although it wasn't given fully to his people until after the Egyptian slavery and the Exodus and the journey to Israel, to Canaan and all of that. He received it a little, but he also didn't receive heaven yet while he was living on the earth. So the Hebrews author says, all these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on earth. You feel like earth is your home? That this is just where, this has got everything you want. Everything's perfect here, you just want to stay here. These characters in Hebrews chapter 11 knew that they are strangers and exiles here on earth. Because as we mentioned, the conflict, the corruption, the perversion of good. Continue reading in verse 14. For those who say such things, make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. What, maybe go back to Mesopotamia where Abraham had come from? No. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. That's why heaven is so worthy of our hope. This is the place we don't fit. Earth. Human society here, ungoverned by God, is not our home. It doesn't fit. Heaven is what fits. Do you hope for that? Do you really hope for that? Not just to avoid hell, but do you look forward to being in the place that God has designed for us, where everything will be good, the place where evil does not influence, the place where things aren't corrupt and twisted? Do you hope for that? And to walk with the God who made you, like Adam and Eve originally did. It's amazing sometimes that our hope is so weak that we lose sight of that for which we were made. We'll come back to that in a little bit. I want to ask you to think about the function of hope. What is its power? What does it do for us? Just this idea of hope. What does it do for us? It motivates us. In lots of things in life, we see the power of hope. That it motivates us to reach a goal, to endure difficulties, to overcome obstacles that are in the way, to go through just really difficult things because we're hoping to get to the thing we're aiming for. Why don't you think about people 200, 300, 400 years ago who made the journey across the Atlantic to come to this continent. They had a hope. And that journey was not easy. I am fortunate enough to know some details about one of my ancestors who came over on the Mayflower. Now, Probably half the people in this room have an ancestor who came over on the Mayflower, because it's far enough back that, they fathered these people, they fathered those people, and they fathered those people. And, you're bound to link up with some of them. So it's nothing special, I think, to say, you had an ancestor on the Mayflower. But I do like the fact that I know about this guy. His name was John Howland. He came over as an indentured servant, if I remember well. An indentured servant was somebody who wanted to come to North America, but didn't have the money to pay for the voyage. And so other people would agree to pay for their, started to say airfare. It wasn't airfare. To pay for their journey on that ship to come over, as long as that person agreed to be their servant for the next number of years, however many number of years they agreed on. And that's how he came over, if I remember correctly. But the journey over, so he was willing to endure that. I'm going to get there and I'm going to have to serve this person for 7 years or something. But I'm hoping to be a free man there eventually. The journey over was not fun. Most of the passengers were stuck in below decks. The sea tossing them around, and you don't get any sense of being able to see what's around you. You're just in the hull of this ship being tossed around in the waves. And they were usually, that's where they had to stay, many of them. And John Howland, I believe it's 7 greats, my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, was just so sick of being below in that ship. He chose a bad time to insist on going out on the deck. It was in the middle of a storm. But maybe that being tossed back and forth is why he wanted to be out where he could at least see the horizon. And so he went up on deck and got washed overboard. You can read about him, John Howland. He got washed overboard in the middle of this storm, but because the storm was so strong, the waves so big, that the ship is leaning. And they have those masts hanging from I believe they're called halyards, these big things that stand up on a ship. And it was leaning so far that rope is trailing over here, and he came across that rope, grabbed it, and eventually got taken back on the boat. But it wasn't a fun journey coming over. Why go through that? Why turn yourself into a servant to somebody else? Because you hope. And that hope motivates you to do difficult things, to endure difficulties. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, chapter 11, beginning in verse 23, we read about so many of the difficult things Paul endured. He's contrasting himself to some in Corinth who were claiming to be apostles and who were telling people don't listen to Paul, and who were telling people how great they were and boasting about things about themselves. Paul says in verse 23, "Are they servants of Christ? I speak as if insane. I more so. In far more labors, in far more imprisonments, beaten times without number, often in danger of death. 5 times I've received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have spent in the deep. I've been on frequent journeys, in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. I've been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. Apart from such external things, there's the daily pressure upon me of concern for all the churches. Who's weak without my being weak? Who's led into sin without my intense concern? I got to say, I haven't been through as many difficult things as Paul's been. Looking at you, I'm guessing you haven't either. But he endured all those difficult things because of his hope. Why? How? I'm turning back to 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Looking at verses 8 and 9, first of all. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not despairing. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. Yeah, things were difficult. But he was hanging on because of his hope. Look at verses 16 through 18. Therefore we do not lose heart, but though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day, for momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. Did Paul just say momentary light affliction? We just read about all the stuff that he endured. How can he call it? It's nothing. Momentary light affliction. How can he call it that? Because in comparison, what's on the other side of that seesaw, the weight of glory that he's hoping for, that he's destined for, that eternal weight of glory is far beyond all comparison. While we look not at the things which are seen, but the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal. Everything you see right now, and every day of your life, it's all temporary. Even what you see of each other, what you see of me, it's temporary. I'm not temporary. You as a person are not temporary. But what we see is our bodies. Everything you see is temporary. But we don't look at that. We look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. That's why, because he sees this weight of glory that we don't actually see with our eyes yet, but we know about it, and we hope for that. And that's what pulled him through all those terrible circumstances that he went through. He endured those things. That's the power of hope. And it's the reason that at the end of his life, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, he's able to say, when he knows he's about to be executed by the Romans, he's able to say, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the course, I have kept the faith. In the future, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. Not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. That's the power of hope. I know you've been through difficult circumstances. I don't know what they are, but I've been through difficult circumstances. You've been through difficult circumstances. Some of them are just random. Some of them are because of your faith. But hope has power to pull you through any of those circumstances. That's wonderful. It's a great blessing. It's a great force, and it's a great tool. But so often, that power of hope is overthrown. It's defeated. It's crushed. Some things destroy that hope. And I think the way that happens, usually at least, is we've substituted some other thing for that hope of heaven. We start hoping for things here. We have a lot of wealth. Now, I know I don't live in one of these neighborhoods. But I live close to a lot of neighborhoods where there are super expensive houses. And I know I will never live in one of those houses. I can't afford that. I know I'm not going to be able to afford that. But still, man, the things I have that nobody in the history of the world until the last 100 years has had. The comfort I have, the fact that I can just go to the store and buy the food that I need to buy. You know, I buy the store brands, save a little money, but I can still buy what I need to buy and have food every day. So understand that when I talk about the kind of wealth we have today. We have a lot. And we can fall in love with all the things we can have and all the things we can do, all the pleasures we can pursue, the material things that we can gain, the recreation that we can arrange for ourselves. And we can start, really focusing on that kind of stuff. It's attractive. And it's easy to get. And that can become our hope. Your home, your house, your family, spending time with family. And I don't want to say spending time with family is a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing. Treasuring your family and nurturing your family and being respectful of your family. Those are good things. But man, we can make that, because it is a good thing and we enjoy it, we can end up making that really our hope. And just pursuing family more than we pursue the Lord. And spending time with family more than spending time with the Lord. And focusing all our kind of extra time energy on family and never spending time with the Lord. We've substituted one hope for the main hope. Or, I like cars. I usually have a fun little car. Don't have one of those right now. But, I want to get back to that point where I do. But I know it's not the most important thing, and yet we can let interest in things like that become our hope. We spend our time on Auto Trader. We spend our time looking at companies that make modifications for the car we like, or whatever it may be. That can become our hope. We spend our time and resources for the things that we substitute for the real hope. And we become so focused on those other things that our hope in heaven becomes destroyed. Oh, we're still involved with church, and we still go to church usually when there's time, and when this other thing isn't interfering with it. The thing that I've started hoping for here on earth, as long as I don't have to sacrifice anything like that, I'll be at church all the time. But if some family activity comes along, or some car event, comes along, and that's where we put our hope. And it's destroying our hope in heaven. Churches do this. The phrase social gospel. What that's about, if you don't know, I'm sure many of you do know, but if you don't know what that's about, it's about solving all the social problems of people. The social gospel. That's not what the gospel is. The gospel is not about, making sure our home life, now it will accomplish these things, but it's not the main thing it's about. But so many churches stop talking about heaven and how to get there and how to follow the Lord and respect the Lord, and they start having all of these programs about how to live life richly. Joel Osteen, a good example of this. How to live life richly and enjoy the blessings of this life and be prosperous and be healthy. Well, none of those individual things are bad. But when that's the gospel that churches present as this is what's important, that's what they emphasize. They put their focus on the here and now and a little on the hereafter, and it's become their hope. And spiritual teaching is lost, and the hope of heaven is destroyed. So final point this morning. Focus. Keep your eyes on the hope of heaven. I want to mention a few different kinds of people that have exhibited this. You think back to the slaves in our country's history, 200 or whatever years ago. They didn't have cars, fancy cars. Well, nobody had any cars back then. But you know what I mean. They didn't have the luxuries of life. They couldn't have the luxuries of life. They had none of what so many of us pursue. They didn't have freedom. They didn't even have the guarantee that the person they married they'd be able to stay with, or that the children they had would stay with them. They couldn't hope to prosper, build bank accounts. And yet, what did they produce? Those spiritual songs they would sing in the field. They were not distracted with all kinds of other things to hope for. So they focused on those spiritual things. And it was important to them. Christians in China. My parents spent 6 months in China. This goes back, 30 years ago. But spent 6 months in China and still in contact. My dad's still in contact with at least one of them. It's illegal in China to worship freely as you want to. The Chinese government allows one official kind of church, and it's a very watered down thing. They would not allow true Christianity to flourish, and yet it does. My parents taught people, baptized people, and led them along, and those people suffered. Some of them were arrested. Some of them were put in prison. Some of them were released later. Some disappeared, never seen again. But they had the hope of heaven. One of them eventually moved to Canada and got married, and she actually came and visited my dad just a few months ago. They weren't focused on other things. They were focused on heaven. Christians in Guatemala. My niece and her husband, my nephew-in-law, I guess, moved to Guatemala several years ago. I went down with them when they first traveled down there to move down there. And I got to meet some of the people there. There was already a church existing there in the city where they went that they were going to be working with. And I remember, I should be able to call his name. Do I have it in my notes? No, I don't. I know his name. I'm going to call him Raphael. Raphael had a wife and 3 little kids, and they lived together in a house out in the middle of the cornfields, or maize fields, I guess. And it was a very simple house. It did have 3 different rooms. The kitchen was a bare, I don't remember if it was concrete or dirt floor, one of the two. The only thing in the kitchen was kind of a concrete block, a little bigger than this table, structure against one wall. And that was their stove. It had a metal plate on the top. It had a place inside where you could build a fire. That was their stove. They had some furniture in the other 2 rooms. The door to walk in the house was a sheet of corrugated metal that they had 3 pieces of wood nailed onto to kind of give it some structure. It had a couple of hinges. The roof was the same thing as the ceiling. It was another sheet of corrugated metal, and I could see holes in it. I could see the sunlight shining through. So I knew on rainy days, water's coming through. This was their home. And there was another structure, I don't know, 20 yards away, 10 yards away, where he had a loom where he wove fabric. And he was talking about the fact I could have gotten a job in the city in an office. He was qualified. He could have gotten a job in the city in an office and made more money. More money sounds nice, right? Could have made more money that way. But he wanted to make his own schedule so that he would have time to work with other brethren in that church there. And time to prepare sermons. He wasn't like the preacher, but he wanted to be involved in that. He also wanted to be able to visit other congregations out in smaller towns across the Guatemalan countryside. And he knew if he got that job in the city where he'd have more money, have a nicer house, because there were nicer houses in that city, he wouldn't have time, and he was focused on the hope of heaven. And that's what he wanted to be busy with. Christians in Zimbabwe, country in Africa. Another man whose name I've forgotten. This is an American man. He preaches in Bowling Green, Kentucky, if any of you have an idea who I'm talking about, who's made travel overseas. Bob Buchanan. He made trips to Zimbabwe, and people would travel miles and miles to come hear him speak. Now, he wasn't saying this, I'm a great speaker. It was the word they were after. They would travel miles and miles, no cars, no horses, no mules. They would walk over kind of mountains to get there for days because they knew there was going to be somebody preaching the Word of God. I want to emphasize how little they had. They didn't have much of anything. They did bring some food with them. There were two girls at kind of a mealtime when they were all sitting around. And they brought Bob, I don't guess it was a whole chicken, but brought him some chicken that had been prepared. And they didn't appear to have any themselves, but they brought chicken for him. And if I remember well, he tried to offer them some of it. No, that's for you. So he ate the chicken, and he ate all of it because he didn't want to be, the guy who, well, I appreciate that you brought me, but I don't really want it all. Well, he ate all of it. At least he ate what we would call all of it. He finished that chicken, and there are the bones on his plate. And these two girls asked, "Are you going to eat those?" And he said, "No." And they asked, "Can we have them?" And they ate those chicken bones. That's how little they had. But their hope was on heaven. They weren't distracted by all kinds of other things. I'm not saying go get rid of everything you have so you're poor. That's not my point. But man, keep your priorities right. They did not have their hope compromised and destroyed. They kept their focus on spiritual things, and they gave themselves to God. Turn into Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. This is right after Hebrews chapter 11, where we read about all those men and women of faith who accomplished difficult things because of their hope, because of their faith. And so they pressed through the difficult things in order to reach that goal that they were hoping for. Hebrews chapter 12, immediately after that, begins with the word therefore. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us. Who's that cloud of witnesses? All those people of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. And the author of Hebrews is really using the scene of the Greek races when he writes verses 1 and 2 of chapter 12, where there was a stadium and there was the stands around where there would be spectators watching those who are running the race. And he uses that imagery in this verse. He uses some of the same words that were used of that Greek race. Since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us in the stands, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus had some difficult things to go through, right? But he, because of that joy set before him, what he was going to accomplish on that cross, who for that joy and his hope of that goal, he endured the difficulties. He despised the shame. The shame of it didn't mean anything to him because he knew what he was reaching for. So like that, let us be encouraged by the cloud of witnesses that are the people from Hebrews chapter 11 saying, you can do this. In the stands, cheering for you, saying, you can do this. They did it. We can too. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance. Focus on your goal. And the sin which so easily entangles us. Get rid of those things from your life because you're focused on your goal. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus and the goal that he has for us. That's what we need to be focused on. We need that simple faith and devotion that we see in the life of Paul, the sense of determination that we see in Jesus himself, the serving by faith through difficult things that we see in all those people from Hebrews chapter 11, and the real focus on heavenly things like we saw in those various people in various parts of the world who just aren't distracted by the things we get distracted by. We need to place our hope in heaven and in God. We're going to stand in a moment and sing our song of invitation, softly and tenderly. Jesus isn't shouting at us in some angry voice. He just calls us, come, come. If you would come to him today, or restore your relationship with him today, won't you come forward as we stand and sing?